The sun dipped below the dusty horizon as Elizabeth Lawson knelt beside her son's grave, the freshly turned earth still a raw wound on the landscape, much like the one in her heart. She placed a single wildflower on the small mound, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the wooden cross bearing the name. Samuel Lawson, beloved son, 1878–1884, 6 years old. Gone in the space of 3 fevered nights that felt like eternity. The April wind carried the scent of sage and coming rain across the rolling plains of Montana Territory, 1884. Elizabeth stood, brushing the dirt from her worn skirt, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the last wagon train had disappeared, taking with it her husband, Frank Edwards. Not in body, no. Frank had ridden out alone 2 weeks after they'd buried their boy, the grief too heavy for him to bear in the small cabin they'd built together 3 years prior. "I need time," he had said, his voice hollow as the empty bedroom where their son had taken his last breath. "I can't stay here with his ghost around every corner." Elizabeth had watched him saddle his horse at dawn, had memorized the slope of his shoulders and the set of his jaw as he'd ridden away without looking back. That had been 4 months ago. The wind picked up, and Elizabeth pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she walked back to the cabin. It sat nestled against a stand of cottonwoods, smoke curling from the chimney where she kept the fire burning, not just for warmth but for him, a beacon for when he was ready to return. Inside, she lit the candle she placed each night in the window facing west toward wherever Frank had gone. It was a ritual born the very night he'd left, a promise to herself and to him that there would always be light to guide him home. "Come back to me," she whispered to the flame. Miles away, Frank Edwards stared into the campfire he'd built, listening to the coyotes call across the plains. His hands, once steady enough to track and shoot game from impossible distances, now shook as he poured whiskey into a tin cup. The liquor burned down his throat, but it didn't touch the cold emptiness that had taken residence in his chest since watching his son's small body convulse with fever. Frank had been a respected rancher back in Sweet Creek, known for his fairness and skill with horses. Now he was just another drifter, taking odd jobs at ranches, moving on before anyone could ask too many questions or offer sympathy he didn't deserve. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small wooden horse he'd carved for Samuel's last birthday. The boy had clutched it even as the fever took hold, his little hand burning hot around the toy. Frank had taken it after they'd buried him, unable to leave it in the cold ground. "I failed you both," he murmured, running his thumb over the smooth wood. The image of Elizabeth's face as he'd ridden away haunted him, the strength in her grief, the silent plea in her eyes. But how could he be the husband she needed when he couldn't even be the father his son had deserved? Frank tucked the wooden horse away and kicked dirt over his fire. Tomorrow he would ride further west. Maybe in the next town, the whiskey would finally wash away the sound of his boy's laughter. Elizabeth woke before dawn, as she had every day since coming to Montana. There was work to be done. The chickens needed feeding, the garden required tending, and the goats would be impatient for milking. Life continued, relentless in its demands, even when grief threatened to swallow her whole. She moved through her chores methodically, finding comfort in the routine. The neighbors, the Baxters, lived 3 miles to the east and checked on her when they could, bringing extra supplies and offers of help. But Elizabeth had grown accustomed to managing on her own. Frank had taught her to shoot, to hunt small game, and to repair what needed fixing. Skills that had once been shared lessons now became her solitary armor against the wilderness. As she worked in her garden that afternoon, Elizabeth thought she heard hoofbeats approaching. Her heart leaped before her mind could caution against hope. She shaded her eyes against the sun and scanned the horizon, but there was nothing but the endless grass bending in the wind. "Fool woman," she chided herself, returning to her vegetables. These phantom sounds had plagued her for weeks after Frank left. Every distant rider became him in her imagination. Every creak of the cabin at night became his footstep on the porch. That evening, as twilight gathered, Elizabeth sat on her porch, mending one of Frank's shirts that she had kept in the trunk at the foot of their bed. She wouldn't allow herself to think about why she preserved his things as though he might need them any day. She simply did it. Just as she lit the candle each night, the flickering light in the window had become something of a legend in the small settlement of Sweet Creek. Folks spoke of the widow, though she wasn't truly a widow who kept faith with a ghost. Some pitied her, others admired her devotion. Elizabeth paid them no mind. What existed between her and Frank was theirs alone. 60 miles southwest, Frank Edwards found himself in a nameless saloon in a town barely marked on any map. 4 months of wandering had led him here, to a place where no one knew his name or his sorrow. He'd taken work at a cattle ranch for the past few weeks, breaking horses that were too wild for the regular hands to manage. "Another," he said to the barkeep, sliding his empty glass forward. The whiskey no longer burned, but neither did it numb. Nothing seemed to dull the sharp edges of his memories. "You might want to slow down, friend," said a voice beside him. Frank turned to see a man in his 50s, gray streaking his beard, eyes that had seen their share of trouble. "Didn't ask for your advice," Frank replied, but there was no heat in his words. "No, you didn't." The man signaled the barkeep for his own drink. "Name's Walter Green. Saw you working those horses out at the Singleton place. Got a gift with them." Frank shrugged. "They're simpler than people." "Ain't that the truth?" Walter sipped his drink. "Where you headed after this?" "Don't know. West, maybe. Running from something or toward something." Frank's head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "That's my business." Walter nodded, unperturbed. "Sure is, but I've seen your kind before." Men with that look in their eye, like they're being chased by something they can't outrun. Frank stared into his whiskey. "My son died. Fever took him. 6 years old." Walter was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry to hear that. Lost my daughter the same way, 15 years ago now." "Does it get easier?" Frank asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. "No," Walter said simply. "But you learn to carry it differently, like a stone in your pocket instead of around your neck. You left someone behind, didn't you?" Frank didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. "My wife and I, we nearly didn't survive our girl's passing," Walter continued. "Almost tore us apart. Would have if I'd listened to the part of me that wanted to ride away." "What stopped you?" "Realized I wasn't the only one grieving. My wife, she needed me as much as I needed her. Grief shared is grief halved, my father used to say." Frank drained his glass. "Some things can't be shared. All due respect, that's horseshit." Walter's voice was gentle despite his words. "You think you're protecting her by taking your pain elsewhere, or are you just protecting yourself from having to witness hers?" Frank stood abruptly. "You don't know anything about it." "Maybe not," Walter conceded. "But I know this: wherever you go, that boy's memory goes with you. And wherever that woman is, she's carrying him too. Might be easier to carry him together." Frank threw money on the bar and walked out without another word, the stranger's assessment cutting too close to the truth he'd been avoiding. Outside in the cool night air, he looked up at the stars, the same stars that shone over Elizabeth, over Samuel's grave. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to fully picture her, tending the garden, feeding the animals, placing that candle in the window each night. He knew she would. Elizabeth was not one to surrender hope easily, and suddenly, with startling clarity, he realized what he'd done. In trying to outrun his grief, he had abandoned the one person who shared it completely. The one person who understood the exact shape and weight of what they'd lost. Elizabeth sat by the fire, a letter in her lap from her sister in St. Louis. It had arrived with the monthly mail delivery, full of concern and an offer to come west and help, or better yet, for Elizabeth to return east where proper civilization could provide comfort. The thought of leaving Sweet Creek, of abandoning the small grave on the hillside, made Elizabeth's chest tighten. This land had claimed her son's body. She would not leave him alone in it. Besides, if she left, how would Frank find her when he was ready to return, if he returned? The thought that had lurked at the edges of her mind for months finally formed fully. What if he never came back? What if grief had driven him not just away but towards some final, irreversible act? Or what if he had simply found a new life, unburdened by the reminders of loss that permeated every inch of their homestead? Elizabeth folded the letter and set it aside. Such thoughts served no purpose. She would continue as she had been, one day at a time, one chore at a time, one candle at a time. She was about to prepare for bed when a knock at the door startled her. It was well past visiting hours, and Sweet Creek wasn't the kind of place where travelers arrived unannounced after dark. Elizabeth reached for the rifle Frank had taught her to use, keeping it low as she approached the door. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "Mrs. Edwards." A woman's voice, familiar but unexpected. Elizabeth opened the door to find Martha Jameson, the doctor's wife, standing on her porch, her face drawn with urgency. "Martha, what brings you out so late? It's Dr. Jameson. He's been called to the Peterson place. Their youngest has taken ill with a fever and the doctor needs your help." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. "My help? You nursed your boy through the fever. You know the signs. Dr. Jameson says you might spot something he would miss." Martha reached for Elizabeth's hand. "Please, they're terrified of losing another child. The Petersons had buried their eldest daughter just last year. Consumption had taken her slowly." Elizabeth knew their fear intimately. "Let me get my shawl." The ride to the Peterson homestead was tense and silent. Elizabeth fought against the memories that threatened to overwhelm her. Samuel's flushed face, his glassy eyes, the way his small body had burned against hers as she'd held him through the worst of it. The Peterson cabin blazed with lamplight as they approached. Inside, Dr. Jameson knelt beside a pallet where 4-year-old Emma Peterson lay, her cheeks bright with fever, her breathing labored. "Mrs. Edwards," the doctor acknowledged her with relief. "Thank you for coming. Her fever spiked an hour ago, and I'm concerned about the pattern of her symptoms." Elizabeth set aside her fear and moved to the child's side. She placed a cool hand on Emma's forehead, noting the heat that radiated from her skin. "Has she complained of a sore throat?" Elizabeth asked, remembering how Samuel had cried that it hurt to swallow. Mrs. Peterson nodded tearfully. "This morning, and she wouldn't eat." "May I?" Elizabeth gestured, and the doctor moved aside. She gently felt along Emma's neck, finding the swollen glands that had also plagued Samuel. But there was something different, a rash beginning at her hairline that Samuel hadn't developed. "Doctor, look at this." She pointed it out. "Samuel didn't have this." Dr. Jameson examined the rash closely. "Scarlet fever, perhaps, not the influenza that took your boy. Different treatment needed." He opened his bag and began mixing a solution. "Your observation may have just saved us valuable time, Mrs. Edwards." Through the night, Elizabeth and the doctor worked together to bring Emma's fever down. Elizabeth showed Mrs. Peterson how to sponge the child with cool water, how to coax sips of liquid between parched lips. By dawn, the fever had broken and Emma slept peacefully, her breathing even. "You have a gift for healing," Dr. Jameson told Elizabeth as they stepped outside into the early morning light. "Have you considered assisting me with other cases? We have no trained nurse in Sweet Creek, and your experience, well, it could help others." Elizabeth looked back at the house where a child would live to see another day. The hollow ache in her chest that had been her constant companion since Samuel's death seemed, for the first time, to ease slightly. "I would be honored," she said. As Martha drove Elizabeth home, the sun crested the eastern hills, painting the plains gold. Elizabeth felt something stir within her, not happiness, exactly, but purpose. A reason to rise each morning beyond simple survival. That night, she placed the candle in the window with renewed resolve. If Frank returned, he would find her changed, still grieving, always grieving, but no longer defined solely by loss. "I'm still waiting," she told the flame, "but I'm also living." Frank Edwards rode through the night, pushing his horse harder than was wise on the uneven terrain. Walter's words had awakened something in him, a realization that in fleeing his grief, he had merely dragged it behind him like a shadow, growing larger and darker with distance. He made camp reluctantly when his horse needed rest. sleeping fitfully beneath the vast Montana sky. In his dreams, Samuel ran through fields of summer grass, always just ahead, always turning back with a laugh that faded too quickly. And behind him, always Elizabeth, watching them both with eyes that held no blame, only patient waiting. Frank woke before dawn, the dream still vivid. He saddled his horse in the gray light and continued northeast, toward Sweet Creek. He had been gone 4 months and 2 weeks. Too long to expect forgiveness, perhaps, but he had to try. As he rode, Frank allowed memories to surface that he had suppressed with whiskey and wandering. Samuel's first steps toward him across the cabin floor. Elizabeth's face, radiant in the firelight as she sang their son to sleep. The 3 of them fishing in the creek that gave the settlement its name, Samuel's delighted squeal when he caught his first trout. The pain was still there, but something else accompanied it now, gratitude for the time they'd had, brief though it was. And beneath that, a longing for Elizabeth that had never truly faded. 3 days of hard riding brought Frank to familiar territory. He passed farms he recognized, nodded to a few farmers who squinted at him with surprise. Word would reach town before he did that Frank Edwards was back. It was dusk when he crested the final hill that overlooked their homestead. The cabin stood as he remembered it, smoke rising from the chimney, the garden out back larger than when he'd left. And there in the window facing west a light, Frank's throat tightened. Every night for over 4 months she had lit that candle. Every night she had kept faith. He approached slowly, suddenly uncertain. What right did he have to return after abandoning her? What words could possibly bridge the chasm his absence had created? At the edge of the property, Frank dismounted and led his horse the rest of the way, his heart pounding as he approached the porch. Before he could knock, the door opened. Elizabeth stood framed in the doorway, her face thinner than he remembered, her eyes wider with shock. She wore a simple blue dress he recognized, her hair tied back but with strands escaping around her face. "Frank," she whispered, his name a breath between them. "Elizabeth." His voice broke on her name. I don't know what to say." She stepped forward, one hand reaching out tentatively as if to verify he was real. Her fingers brushed his cheek and Frank closed his eyes at the touch he had denied himself for too long. "You came back," she said simply. "I should never have left." Elizabeth nodded, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, simply acknowledging the truth of his statement. "Are you staying?" She asked, and in that question was all the fear and hope of the months she had spent alone. "If you'll have me," Frank replied. "I don't deserve it, I know that, but I've learned something, Elizabeth. Grief doesn't get smaller when you run from it, and it's too heavy to carry alone." Tears filled her eyes, but she blinked them away. "Then come inside, Frank Edwards. We have much to talk about." She stepped back, making room for him to enter the home they had built together, where they had loved and lost and might, perhaps, begin again. Inside, the cabin was as Frank remembered it, yet subtly different. Samuel's wooden toys no longer sat in the corner where he had played. Instead, they were arranged carefully on a small shelf above the fireplace, a memorial rather than an open wound. New curtains hung at the windows, and books Frank didn't recognize lined the small bookshelf. "You've made changes," he observed. "I had to," Elizabeth replied, moving to the stove where a pot simmered. "Would you like some stew? I always make extra now." For the Jameson family when the doctor is called away, or for Mrs. Baker when her arthritis is bad. Frank nodded, suddenly aware of how hungry he was. "That would be kind, thank you." Elizabeth served him silently, then sat across from him at the table they had crafted together during her pregnancy. Frank ate slowly, watching her, noting the new confidence in her movements, the purpose in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "You've changed too," he said finally. "Yes." Elizabeth met his gaze directly. "I had to do that as well. Will you tell me about these months since I've been gone?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. "After you left, I thought I might die from the loneliness. It was as if I'd lost both of you, but then Dr. Jameson called me to help with a child who had taken ill with fever. Emma Peterson, she lived, Frank. I helped save her. Pride shone through her grief as she continued. After that, the doctor asked me to assist him. I've become a kind of nurse to Sweet Creek. Not trained, of course, but I learn quickly. I help bring babies into the world and ease the passing of those who are leaving it. I sit with the sick and teach mothers how to care for fevered children. Frank listened, amazed at the strength of the woman before him. You found meaning in what happened to Samuel. I tried. Some days are better than others. Elizabeth's voice softened. There are still nights I cry myself to sleep, still mornings I expect to hear his laughter. But yes, I found a way to honor him by helping others. I'm proud of you, Frank said, the words inadequate but sincere. And you? Elizabeth asked. Where have you been? What have you been doing? Frank looked down at his hands. Nothing so noble. I drifted, worked ranch jobs, drank too much, tried to forget but never could. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the wooden horse. I carried him with me, though, everywhere I went. Elizabeth's breath caught at the sight of the toy. She reached out and took it, cradling it in her palm. I used to wonder if you had it. I hoped you did. I couldn't leave it behind. Elizabeth rose and placed the horse on the shelf with Samuel's other toys. It belongs here with the rest of him, with us. Frank stood too, uncertain of his place in this new life she had built. Elizabeth, I know I have no right to ask anything of you. If you want me to go, I will understand. Elizabeth turned to face him, her expression both tender and resolute. Frank Edwards, I have lit a candle in that window every night for 4 months and 2 weeks. I did not do that so you could come home and leave again. But after what I did, you were drowning in grief, so was I. You found your way through it by leaving, I found mine by staying. We both did what we had to do to survive. Elizabeth stepped closer to him. The question now is whether we can find a way forward together. Frank reached for her hands, half expecting her to pull away. She didn't. I want that more than anything, he said. I've missed you every day, Elizabeth, not just since I left, but since we lost him. I've missed the way we were together before grief pulled us apart. Elizabeth squeezed his hands. We will never be those people again, Frank. Samuel's death changed us both, but perhaps we can build something new from what remains. Frank nodded, understanding the wisdom in her words. I would like to try if you would. I would. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears again, but she was smiling through them. Welcome home, Frank. That night, they slept in the same bed for the first time in months, not touching but aware of each other's presence. The sound of 2 people breathing in the darkness, both strange and familiar. Before she fell asleep, Elizabeth reached across the space between them and took Frank's hand. I kept my promise, she whispered. I lit a candle every night until you knocked on my door. Frank brought her hand to his lips. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that faith. As spring turned to summer, Frank and Elizabeth Edwards learned to be husband and wife again. It was not easy. There were days when grief still overwhelmed them, when the sight of a child Samuel's age in town would send one or both of them into silent remembrance. There were nights when Frank woke shouting from nightmares, and days when Elizabeth would stand at Samuel's grave for hours, unable to move forward. But there were also moments of rediscovered joy. Frank resumed his work with horses, his skill returning as he trained mounts for the local ranches. Elizabeth continued her work with Dr. Jameson, her reputation for gentle competence spreading through the territory. Together, they tended their land, expanded the garden, and repaired the cabin that had weathered a winter of Elizabeth's solitary care. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching a thunderstorm roll across the plains, Elizabeth turned to Frank with a tentative smile. Dr. Jameson says there's a medical college in Denver that's accepting women now. He thinks I have the aptitude to train properly as a nurse, maybe even a doctor someday. Frank studied her face, seeing the hope and uncertainty there. Do you want to go? I've thought about it, but it would mean leaving here, leaving. She glanced toward the hillside where their son rested. Frank took her hand. Samuel isn't only there, Elizabeth, he's here. He touched his heart, and here, he touched hers. We would carry him with us wherever we went. You would consider it, leaving Sweet Creek. I would consider anything that brought you happiness, Frank said honestly. Besides, Denver isn't so far, we could come back to visit, and maybe a fresh start would be good for both of us. Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder, the gesture of affection becoming more natural between them again. I don't need to decide right away, Doctor. Jameson says the next term doesn't begin until spring. We have time then, Frank said, his arm coming around her shoulders, to see if it's right for us. They sat in companionable silence, watching the lightning illuminate the vast Montana sky. The rain, when it came, was gentle at first, then strengthened to a steady downpour that drummed on the cabin roof. Remember how Samuel used to dance in the rain? Elizabeth asked, her voice wistful but no longer broken. He'd come in soaked to the bone and you'd pretend to scold him, Frank recalled, smiling at the memory, but I never could stay angry, not when he looked so happy. Frank stood suddenly, holding out his hand to her. Come with me. Where? Into the rain. Elizabeth looked at him in surprise. We'll get drenched. Exactly. Frank's eyes held a spark she hadn't seen since before Samuel's illness. When was the last time you danced in the rain, Elizabeth? A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her, a sound so unexpected it startled them both. She took his hand and let him lead her off the porch into the warm summer downpour. The rain soaked them immediately, plastering Elizabeth's dress to her body and Frank's shirt to his shoulders. For a moment they stood facing each other, rain streaming down their faces. Then Frank pulled her close and began to sway, a slow dance to music only they could hear. Elizabeth followed his lead, her arms going around his neck as they moved together in the mud of their front yard. It was absurd, impractical, nothing like the careful, measured way they had been approaching their reunion, and it was exactly what they needed. Elizabeth threw her head back and laughed again, the sound carrying across the rain-washed plains. Frank joined her, his own laughter rusty but genuine. They danced until they were breathless, until the rain began to ease, until they were both covered in mud and grinning like fools. Later, dried and changed into clean clothes, they sat before the fire, the atmosphere between them shifted into something new. The careful distance they had maintained even after Frank's return had dissolved in the rain and laughter. Thank you, Elizabeth said, her hair still damp around her shoulders. For what? For reminding me that joy is still possible. Frank reached for her hand. Samuel would have wanted that for us, I think, to remember him with smiles as well as tears. Yes, Elizabeth agreed, he would have. That night when they went to bed, the space between them disappeared as Frank gathered Elizabeth in his arms. They made love slowly, rediscovering each other, healing in the most ancient way humans knew. And afterward, as Elizabeth drifted toward sleep, Frank whispered against her hair. I love you, Elizabeth Edwards. I never stopped, not for a moment. I know, she murmured. I love you too. September brought cooler weather and a letter from the medical college in Denver, confirming that they would welcome Elizabeth's application for the spring term. She and Frank discussed it long into the night, weighing the opportunity against their attachment to the land that held their history. If we go, Elizabeth said, I want to make sure Samuel's grave is properly marked, something permanent, not just the wooden cross. We could commission a stone from the mason in Helena, Frank suggested. Something that would last, Elizabeth nodded. And we would need to find someone to care for the property. I couldn't bear to sell it. The Baxters might be interested in leasing the land. Their boys are growing up, needing room to expand. We could keep the cabin for when we visit. They planned carefully, making lists of what would need to be done before a possible move in the spring. The decisions brought them closer, giving them a shared future to build toward. In October, they rode to Helena together to select a headstone for Samuel's grave. The mason offered various designs, but Frank and Elizabeth settled on a simple marker of polished granite, with Samuel's name, dates, and the words beloved son carved beneath a small carved horse that matched the wooden toy Frank had carried during his absence. It's perfect, Elizabeth said, tracing the design on the mason's drawing. He would have liked it. The stone would be ready in a month, the mason promised. Frank paid him half in advance, the money saved from his work training horses through the summer. On the ride home, they stopped to rest by a creek lined with trees turning gold with autumn. Elizabeth spread a blanket while Frank tended the horses, and they shared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and apples. "I've been thinking," Frank said as they ate, "about what we might do in Denver besides your studies." "Oh," Elizabeth looked interested. "What did you have in mind?" "There's always need for good horsemen in a growing city. Livery stables, training, maybe even breeding if we can save enough to buy land outside the city." Elizabeth smiled. "You've given this real thought." "I have," Frank admitted. "I want this to be a new beginning for both of us, not just for you, and—" He hesitated, then continued, "I've been thinking about family too." Elizabeth's hand stilled on her bread. "Family, I know nothing could ever replace Samuel," Frank said quickly. "I wouldn't want to, but someday when we're ready, I'd like us to consider having another child." Tears gathered in Elizabeth's eyes, but they weren't the devastated tears of grief that had been so common in the past year. These were complicated, holding both sorrow and possibility. "I've thought about it too," she confessed. "Sometimes I feel guilty for even considering it." Frank took her hand. "We have room in our hearts, Elizabeth. Loving another child wouldn't diminish our love for Samuel." "No," she agreed softly. "It wouldn't." They didn't speak of it again that day, but the possibility hung between them, not an immediate plan, but a door left open to the future. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Sweet Creek in snow before November's end. The headstone was delivered and installed on a clear, cold day, Frank and Elizabeth standing together as the mason and his assistant set it in place. It looked right. Elizabeth thought permanent and dignified, yet with the small carved horse adding a touch that was uniquely Samuel. As Christmas approached, their preparations for a possible move to Denver continued. Elizabeth studied medical texts borrowed from Dr. Jameson. Frank corresponded with livery owners in the city, establishing connections that might lead to work. They sorted through their possessions, deciding what to take and what to leave if they made the journey. On Christmas Eve, they invited the Baxters, the Jamesons, and a few other neighbors for a small gathering. The cabin was warm with firelight and fragrant with pine boughs Elizabeth had gathered. Frank had roasted a turkey, and Elizabeth had baked pies with the last of the summer's preserved berries. As their guests enjoyed the food and company, Dr. Jameson raised his glass in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, smiling at Frank and Elizabeth. "And to the ways love finds to grow even in the harshest conditions." "To new beginnings," the others echoed. Later, after their guests had departed and they sat alone by the fire, Frank presented Elizabeth with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Merry Christmas," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. Elizabeth unwrapped it carefully to find a small leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with her initials. "ELE. It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the smooth leather. "I thought you might use it to record your observations when you begin your studies," Frank explained. "Or perhaps before that, to write about Samuel, the memories we want to keep." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "That's perfect, thank you." She handed him a package of her own, "And this is for you." Frank unwrapped it to find a new saddle blanket, intricately woven in patterns of blue and gray. "I worked on it at night after you were asleep," Elizabeth said. "The Baxter women taught me the pattern." "It's magnificent," Frank said, genuinely impressed by her craftsmanship. "Thank you." They sat together in the firelight, the gifts exchanged more than mere objects, they were promises of support for each other's paths forward. "Are we going to do this?" Frank asked quietly. "Denver in the spring." Elizabeth considered the question seriously, as she had many times over the previous months. "I think we are," she said finally. "Not to leave Sweet Creek behind, but to carry it with us into something new." Frank nodded, relieved and excited in equal measure. "Then we'll go together." "Together," Elizabeth agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder as the fire burned low. As winter deepened, their plans solidified. The Baxters agreed to lease the land and care for the cabin in their absence. Elizabeth's application to the medical college was accepted, with classes to begin in April. Frank secured a position at a livery stable in Denver, with the promise of advancement if he proved as skilled as his references claimed. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they often sat together reading Elizabeth her medical texts, Frank books on horse breeding and business management. Sometimes they would pause and share a passage that interested them, or simply look up and smile at the comfortable domesticity they had rebuilt. The candle still burned in the window each night, but its meaning had changed. No longer a beacon for a lost husband, it had become a memorial for their son, and a symbol of the light they had found again in each other. March brought the first signs of spring green shoots pushing through melting snow, birds returning from southern migrations. Frank and Elizabeth prepared for their departure, packing trunks with the possessions they would take, making arrangements for the transport of their horses and essential supplies. The night before they were to leave, they walked together to Samuel's grave. The headstone stood solid against the evening sky, its polished surface catching the last rays of sunset. Elizabeth knelt and placed a small bunch of early wildflowers at the base of the stone. "We're going away for a while, my love," she said softly, "but we'll come back to visit. And we carry you with us always." Frank stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "We love you, son," he added. "That never changes no matter where we are." They stood in silence for a few minutes more, each with their private thoughts and memories. Then, as twilight deepened, they walked hand in hand back to the cabin that had witnessed their greatest joy and deepest sorrow. Inside, Elizabeth moved to the window and lit the candle one last time. "For Samuel," she said, "and for us." Frank wrapped his arms around her from behind, both of them watching the small flame dance in the gathering darkness. "For all of us," he agreed. "Past, present, and future." They left at dawn the next morning, their wagon loaded with trunks and supplies, their horses tethered behind. As they crested the hill that would take Sweet Creek out of sight, they paused and looked back at the cabin nestled against the cottonwoods, at the small grave on the hillside marked by its granite stone. "We'll be back," Frank promised. Elizabeth nodded, her hand finding his between them on the wagon seat. "Yes, we will. But for now we go forward." Frank clicked to the horses, and the wagon moved on, carrying them toward Denver, toward new beginnings that honored rather than erased their past. Behind them, Sweet Creek faded from view, but the memories they carried of a laughing boy with his wooden horse, of grief endured and love rekindled, those remained clear and precious, guiding them into whatever lay ahead. And in the years to come, there would indeed be new joy. Elizabeth's graduation from medical college, Frank's successful breeding operation outside Denver, and eventually, a daughter named Sarah who grew up knowing stories of the brother she never met. Each summer, they would return to Sweet Creek, to tend Samuel's grave and renew their connection to the place where their family had begun. But they carried more than memories from that cabin on the Montana plains. They carried the knowledge that love, once thought lost, could find its way home again like a traveler guided by a candle's steady flame through the darkest night.